wherever you are in the world. And thank you for joining, and thank you to Ari. This CSP program has become one of the most ambitious and successful programs of Jewish learning in the whole history of the Jewish people. Every single week we get so many wonderful announcements. So thank you to Ari, and thank you to all who make this possible. We're going to talk about synagogues. There's any number of jokes that we can start with, but I'd like to be a little serious for a moment and ask really the question about whether this institution has a future and what it might look like. There was a very, very famous article quoted frequently by the great Brandeis University historian Simon Ravidovich, and it was called The Ever-Dying People. And what Ravidovich points out is that in every generation of Jewish life, there has been a deep anxiety about whether the next generation will continue. Starting with Abraham, this is what this week's Torah portion is about. Will the next generation take this as seriously as the past? Will we be able to transmit Jewish values, Jewish ideas, the truth of the Jewish tradition? Will we be able to transmit a love of Torah and a love of people to the next generation? It's part of the anxiety is a part of us. Right? Elie Wiesel once said the simplest definition of who is a Jew, or Steinsaltz rather, said the simplest definition of who is a Jew is anybody who's worried about whether his grandchildren are going to be Jewish. So the anxiety about transmission of this tradition is part of us. What Davidovich points out in the article, though, is that an ever-dying people is an ever-renewing people. And that this is a people possessed of a unique capacity of spiritual resilience and cultural creativity. And that what kept us alive generation after generation wasn't just a sense of devotion and loyalty to what our ancestors did. It's much deeper than that. What's kept us alive and moving forward in our history has been a deep well of creativity, inventiveness, experimentation, innovation, to try to find a new way to express ancient truths in a different idiom, in the idiom of contemporary conditions, contemporary people. And that you should never underestimate the spiritual resistance and cultural creativity of the Jewish people. And this has become something that I'm deeply, deeply committed to, because I think that we get so wrapped up in the narrative of our anxiety. First of all, I don't think that narrative is productive, because who wants to be on a sinking ship? Who wants to be told that a culture doesn't have a future? Who would sign on to such a project? And second of all, because I don't think it's historically realistic. I teach young rabbis at the American Jewish University, and I don't think that a dying people creates people like that creative, that interesting, that devoted. And third of all, because it's just not the truth of our people. Our people has always found a way to reinvent itself, to reinvent our institutions, reimagine our purposes in the world, reorganize the way we live, reinterpret our deepest truths, and rearticulate, to state over again, the values that mean the most to us. And so I'm going to ask you, please consider at least a balancing narrative, the narrative of the capacity of the Jewish people to reinvent itself anew, generation after generation, and even in this moment. I'll give you just a simple hint that the great books and heroes of tradition were not created, and those people were not heroes of simply carrying forward what they received from the past. The people who put together our Tanakh put it together at a moment of crisis when they knew that the people of Israel needed a new infusion of spirit and vision. That the guys who wrote the Talmud were trying to create a Judaism after the destruction of the Holy Temple. That Maimonides was trying to create a new Judaism on the basis of Aristotelian philosophy. That the Zohar, the great mystical tradition, was written at a moment when Jewish life was all but lost in a Christianizing Spain. And here was a way to imagine that God was close nevertheless, that Hasidism was a reinvention of Judaism and a rejection of the Jewish past. And perhaps the most radical of all was Zionism, which was widely condemned by the traditional masters. But today we recognize it as what's kept us alive through a very difficult 20th century. Don't underestimate the spiritual resilience and cultural creativity of the Jewish people. Now let's turn our attention to an institution that many of us are familiar with. If the Jewish people is the ever-dying people, the synagogue is the ever-dying institution. It's an ever-dying institution for a really interesting structural reason, because the institutional progress of synagogues is never as fast as the cultural progress of the world around us. And so those of us who spend our days in synagogue know that every generation gets the shul that its parents would have been really proud of. But when we look at the American synagogue and the history of the American synagogue, you can detect that cultural creativity and spiritual resilience. And that's what I want to do in the next just few minutes, to take you on a thumbnail tour of the history of the American synagogue, to show you how it has changed and how it has grown and how it has adjusted over these generations. And what I'll ask you to do is, you have a handout now. When we're finished here, take that and take a look at some of these sources, because you will be astonished by what you discover there. So let's begin. Here we have the New York Herald editorial. New York Herald was Pulitzer's newspaper, not a Jewish newspaper. And this is an editorial, July 22nd, 1872. So you'll recognize who they're talking about. There was a great immigration of German Jews in the 1830s and 1840s. And by the 1870s, that community was entering its second generation. And the Herald writes as follows, in an editorial in a secular newspaper: to maintain Judaism in America, something more than a mere recitation of prayer in Hebrew and German is necessary. People are more intelligent than they were a century ago, and any religious system that doesn't keep up with the progressive spirit of the age must expect to meet just a crisis in which the Jewish church in America finds itself, the ever-dying synagogue. The rising generation demands a form of religion which their hearts can appreciate and hold fast. They ask for no change in the true spirit. It's an attempt to confine them. It's the attempt to confine them, and here's a great phrase, to the iron bands of the system of bygone ages that has produced results which the Hebrew press generally and frequently lament. That young Israelites don't manifest the love for the synagogue which their fathers and forefathers showed. Now imagine that. In 1872, they're already fetching that kids don't come to shul. But it goes more than that, because you know that 1872 is just on the verge of the great immigration to America, which begins in 1884. And from 1884 to 1920, 2.5 million Jews from Eastern Europe crowd into the Lower East Side. Now, when many of us think about that generation, because we've been watching Fiddler on the Roof and visited Hester Street, and you ask American Jews, tell me about your ancestors, every single American Jew says the same thing. My ancestors, my great-grandfather was a very Orthodox rabbi. It turns out that the 2.5 million Jews were all Orthodox rabbis, every single one of them, even the women. And they were all very pious and very observant. And compared to us, look how far the generations have fallen. You hear that story over and over again. As the great George Gershwin once, or Ira Gershwin once wrote, it ain't necessarily so. How do we know? You want to hear a simple reason that we know? 2.5 million Jews lived on the Lower East Side. That means 1.25 million men, 1.25 million women. Of the 1.25 million women, let's say half of them were in the ages of childbirth. So let's say half of them, 600,000 Jewish women. How many mikvahs would you need for 600,000 Jewish women? There weren't that many. In fact, there were many, many fewer than that. What the historians tell us now is that, yeah, synagogues thrived on the Lower East Side because they were Landsmannschaften. They were a place where Romanian Jews could go and listen to Romanian davening and talk about the old country, Romania, 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 Romania. And they forgot about the anti-Semitism that's taken them to America. And all they could think about was the pastrami and the mamalige. And if you were Polish, you listened to the Polish davening. And if you're Litvak, you listened to Litvak davening. It was a place where we could go and hear the ancient languages that we brought with us, the languages of the old country, and eat the foods from the old country, and meet people from the old country. That's what the Lower East Side Synagogue was. And what's so amazing is that we forgot that part of it. Now, the next generation comes, first generation of native-born Americans. And so we moved out of the Lower East Side into Brooklyn. And we moved out of the south side of Chicago a little bit north. And we moved out, well, Los Angeles didn't exist at the time, but yes, it did, obviously. We moved from Boyle Heights to West Adams, or whatever community you're in, you move to the second place of Jewish settlement. And that second generation still had a very deep love and loyalty to their parents and their parents' culture. But that second generation, American-born, wanted to become American. In 1925, the Jewish Board of Ministers of New York, that's what they call themselves, held this conference, a series of monthly meetings called The Problems of the Jewish Ministry. And they took the edited transcripts of those sessions and put them together in a little book. And the book is such a beautiful snapshot of what Judaism looks like in 1926. And it isn't anything what our ancestors told us about. Here's a piece that I find so beautiful from a rabbi named Israel Goldfarb. Now, the formal title of Rabbi Israel Goldfarb, he was the rabbi of the Kane Street Synagogue in Brooklyn, which today is a wonderful shul, by the way. You know Rabbi Israel Goldfarb for two reasons. Number one, he was the rabbi at Aaron Copland's bar mitzvah and was very close to the Copland family. And I'm told that Aaron Copland sang his Haftorah to the melody of Appalachian Spring. And number two, he was an instructor in Jewish music at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he is the composer of Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharet. Moses didn't bring that melody from Sinai. There was a guy in the 1920s who wrote that melody, and his name is Israel Goldfarb. And there's a third reason you know him and may have cursed his name, and I'll show you what it is. This was Rabbi Goldfarb's contribution to the conference on the problems of the Jewish ministry, 1926. Of all the problems that beset the American rabbi of today, none is more complex and more difficult to solve than how to bring the child closer to the synagogue, how to arouse his interest in things Jewish and secure his permanent attachment to the ideals and faith of our people. Didn't happen in the old country, because in the old country, we were all very Jewish. We lived in a Jewish environment. But here in Brooklyn of 1926, kids go to public school. And here in Brooklyn of 1926, they're not interested in coming to synagogue. So what he says at the end of this is quite remarkable. We rabbis have to develop new skills. Remember, what a rabbi meant in 1926 was a fellow who was trained to answer halakhic questions from the sources of the Jewish tradition. And what he says instead is, no, we have to be something else. I only wish to add that the future of Judaism in America lies in a proper, intelligent, and sympathetic understanding of the child. Whoever taught that as kids in a yeshiva? We may preach inspiring sermons, organize fine musical services. We may create aesthetics atmospheres in our synagogues and temples. But unless we study the child's mind and heart and seek to develop in him a sense of Jewish responsibility, our fine superstructures are doomed to collapse. So you know what he did? He created something you all know. He invited the boys of the neighborhood into the shul to have a bar mitzvah. Now, bar mitzvah existed before that. Bar mitzvah meant a boy turns 13. His father brought him to minyan on Monday morning. The kid, Remy, read a little bit of Torah, put on tefillin for the first time, had a schnapps, a little bit of herring, and then went to school. No, says Goldfarb. We got to make a bigger deal about this. So we moved the bar mitzvah to Shabbos morning, made a big deal about it. And then he did one more thing. He invited the caterer into the shul and created the world's first bar mitzvah party. And when the first kid had a bar mitzvah party, well, that's how this curse has now taken us over. But what really wonderful is that after the first class of boys had their bar mitzvahs at his shul, they came back to him and said, we loved learning with you. Let's keep doing that. And so on Saturday afternoons, Rabbi Goldfarb created the Akiba Society, where he would teach the boys some Torah and then play basketball together. And it was the first Jewish youth group in Brooklyn. And then when the girls saw that we're doing that, the girls weren't allowed to have bat mitzvahs then, but they wanted something similar. So he created the Rachel Society for the girls. And for the first time, you had a synagogue that was reaching families, at least reaching kids. And that was Goldfarb's contribution to American Judaism and how he changed the texture of the synagogue. Well, that was one big change. The other big change happened a little bit farther south in Brooklyn. The other big change was that many rabbis came to understand that the synagogue has to be more than a place of prayer and Jewish learning. It has to be a place where the community can gather. Much later, Mordechai Kaplan will write this into a philosophy, but the philosophy existed long before Kaplan did it. And the philosophy was anything that Jews do together is de facto Judaism. And so what we have invented in the 20s is the synagogue center, or what we came to call the shul with a pool. Synagogues that had gymnasiums where kids can play and adults could play basketball. English language classes, citizenship classes, knitting circles, all kinds of crafting. The synagogue center was an answer to the question, how do we bring Jews together if they don't want to come to shul? Or maybe if we bring them together for exercise classes, dance classes, cooking classes, book groups, movies, they'll wander into the sanctuary and pray with us. And so in the same book, we find Israel Leventhal, who was the rabbi of the Brooklyn Jewish Center, telling us that the synagogue must be Shaul Keneged Shamayim Va'aretz, as a line connecting heaven and earth. The highest ideals of our religious life with the needs of everyday worldly life, so that Aretz, the earthly activities, we may reach Shamayim and touch the very dome of heaven, and through the inspiration of our heavenly ideals, mold a better, nobler existence here. The Brooklyn Jewish Center was the first great Jewish center, and the idea spread all across the country. It was what they called a 24/7 synagogue. Not just a place to daven Shabbos morning and have minyan on the weekday mornings and have a little Talmud class, but something going on in that building every day, every night, every day of the week. The place was always filled with people. And Israel Leventhal had a particularly wonderful idea about this, because he said, if we're going to do it, let's do it right. So the art director, the arts and crafts director of the Brooklyn Jewish Center was Mark Rothko. And the drama director was Moss Hart, who then left Brooklyn, did Broadway, and then came to Hollywood and became a big Hollywood producer. And the cantor of the Brooklyn Jewish Center was Richard Tucker, before he was recruited by the Metropolitan Opera. We're going to do it, and we're going to do it right. Not everybody agreed. Not everybody agreed. There were some rabbis who said, you build a gym, you offer all these classes, you have a bowling alley, that's wonderful. But that's not going to get people to be Jewish. And one of the principal resistors, one of the principal opponents of this idea was the most powerful rabbi in America, a man by the name of Stephen S. Wise, who ran the Free Synagogue in Manhattan. Free on both senses. It was free, didn't have to pay anything to join, and it was free because he could say whatever he wanted. Now, the Free Synagogue in Manhattan never built a building. Not till 1948 did they build a building. Until then, Stephen S. Weiss packed Carnegie Hall every Sunday morning. And when they couldn't get into Carnegie Hall because he packed it, all of his sermons were simulcast on WEVD, the first Jewish media star. Stephen S. Weiss gives a commencement address at Hebrew Union College, and he puts in the commencement address these wonderful words. He says to the gentleman, if you have something to say to people that fills you with living fire, talking to rabbis now, it will not be necessary to have music or cooking classes or bowling alleys or gymnastics in order to bring people to the source of things for which they must long. If you feel this way, you can preach in such seething syllables as to make them feel it. But unless you preach in that way, I advise you to go into some more honest occupation. And so the Synagogue Center thrives into the 1930s and 1940s. And then, of course, comes the Second World War, right? Millions of Americans are drafted and sent abroad to fight the war, including hundreds of thousands of Jews, mostly, of course, Jewish men. And when they return from the war, something amazing happens in the next generation. As soon as they return from the war, they marry their high school sweethearts, and they want to begin lives. But they're unsatisfied staying in the tenements and crowded neighborhoods of the inner cities where they grew up. And there was an interesting Jewish fellow by the name of Arthur Levitt. Maybe you've heard of him. Arthur Levitt looked at the way that we built battleships and tanks and airplanes during the Second World War. We built them on assembly lines. And he came up with the most interesting idea. If we can build battleships, airplanes, and tanks on assembly lines, why can't we build homes the same way? So he bought a stretch of land in Long Island, and he built the first tract housing. And he called it for himself. It was called Levittown. Then he did it again in Pennsylvania, and today it's called Cherry Hill. And the model was copied all over the country, including here in Southern California by a guy named Boyer. And I grew up in one of Boyer's developments. It was a tract of houses. There were 3 different models. You could choose one of 3 different colors. And a man and his wife coming from the service with an FHA loan could buy a 3-bedroom house on a lot with a little yard for $2,400. And there was a proviso that you were not allowed to fence in the lot because he didn't want people to be so terribly lonely. And out of the inner cities and tenements came thousands of Jewish families into suburbia. And out of the East Coast and the Midwest came thousands of Jewish families to Southern California and to Southern Florida. And we spread out. Now, what happened to synagogues? Suddenly, you were too far away from home to go to the shul you grew up with. So you had to create your own. And the great thing about these communities is that everybody was the same age. And then one more amazing thing happened, something called the baby boom. Just before the Second World War, the fertility rate among American women was 1.7 children per woman, which is even below replacement level. Just after the Second World War, and for the next 20 years, the fertility rate of American women went from 1.7 to 3.7. I don't know if any of you are the 0.7 kid. Suddenly, there were children everywhere. Suddenly, there were kids everywhere. And we find ourselves in a neighborhood with lots of kids, and we have an urge to do something. If it's not to celebrate Yiddishkeit, Jewish stuff ourselves, at least we feel an obligation to share it with the kids. And so out of suburbia in post-war America comes the Suburban Family Synagogue. This is the membership brochure for the Israel Community Center of Levittown, New York in 1948. Listen carefully to the language. This is the brochure that they put in supermarkets and hair salons so that people might know they're building a shul. Many of our people have had little previous contact with synagogue life, having hitherto regarded the synagogue as the province of their elders. Many have not seen the inside of a shul since their bar mitzvah. Now, however, they feel it's time that they grow up, in quotation marks, and they have consequently acquired a renewed interest in synagogue activity. The responsibilities of parenthood have led many to rethink their position with regard to the Jewish heritage, which they now seek to maintain in order to be able to transmit it to their children. In Levittown, this return to Judaism is facilitated for them through the existence of a synagogue consisting of like-minded Jewish parents. The post-war era saw a boom in the building of synagogues. More synagogues were built. More people joined synagogues. More Hebrew schools started in the post-war years than ever before in America, or frankly, ever before, ever. And suddenly synagogues were everywhere, but an interesting kind of synagogue. If you listen to the language, we're not building a synagogue because we have spiritual longings. We're not building a synagogue because we feel an obligation to join and pray and learn Torah. We're not building a synagogue for ourselves. We're building a synagogue for our children. So we don't go to synagogue, but we send our kids to the synagogue. And we want a synagogue that's going to train our kids to be Jewish, but not too Jewish, because we don't want to be alienated from our own children. And this is what Herb Gans, who's a great sociologist, discovered when he studied the Jewish communities of, he called it Forest Park. Forest Park, it was Highland Park, Illinois, one of the ritzy suburbs of Chicago. They started with a Hebrew school, and then they built a shul. But there was a conflict between those who wanted the shul for the kids and those who wanted the shul for themselves. And the people who wanted the shul for the kids, they won out. Many of us were raised in those synagogues. They specialized in family services. 7:30 Friday night. You got together, the cantor sang some songs. Pretty soon it was important to be able to sing Jewish liturgy to Simon and Garfunkel melodies. Adon olam asher malach, b'terem kol yitzir nivra, because if the kids will hear their melodies, that'll bring them back to shul. And the rabbi got to tell stories, and that's how the synagogue grew. The conservative movement, the reform movement, put out beautiful prayer books for these new things, but the prayer books had to be accessible. And the service became decorous and polite and easy to listen to. But there was something missing. And one of the chief critics of the suburban synagogue, even as they were being built, was the great philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel, who came to my union, the Rabbinical Assembly, in 1953, and he talked about what we've done to the synagogue. And here's what he says. Our services, he says, talking to rabbis again, are conducted with pomp and precision. The rendition of the liturgy is smooth. Everything is present, decorum, voice, and ceremony. But one thing is missing, life. Nothing is going to happen in the soul. Our motto is monotony. The fire has gone out of worship. It is stiff and cold and dead. Inorganic Judaism. He had a great way to express himself. Has the synagogue become a graveyard where prayer is buried? And here's the line that everyone remembers. The modern synagogue suffers from a severe cold. The critics of the suburban synagogue said, you're doing everything right except one thing. You're not reaching the soul of people. And you've put in so much energy in protecting the institution, you forgot what our true purpose was in this. And what happened from that was, well, two things, of course. That was the beginning of the Great Revolt. And in the late post-war years, the late 20th century, we saw the disaffiliation of American Jews from synagogues. People left shul because the next generation, that post-war generation, didn't feel any particular, my generation, didn't feel any particular need to join a shul, maybe to have a bar mitzvah for their kids, but after the bar mitzvah, the family left the shul. In fact, the statistics were that 87% of American Jews belonged to a shul at some point or another in their lives, but only 10 to 15% belong now, which means that they come for what they want, get what they want, and then they leave. But there was a spark that was lit by people like Heschel. And something happened in the next generation, which is that The synagogue needs to return to its roots in touching the soul of Jews. And so you find in the next generation a revolt against the formality of the synagogue, a revolt against the formality of prayer, a revolt that tried to bring us back to what at least was romantically imagined as an emotional moment in pre-synagogue times. And you find neo-Hasidism and new mysticism, and the word spirituality now becomes an important word in our Jewish vocabulary. And so you have in the year 2000 a wonderful study of the American Jewish community by two scholars, Arnie Eisen, who was then a Stanford professor and went on to become the chancellor of JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Stephen Cohn, who at the time was a demographer at Hebrew Union College and NYU, and has since had some personal issues which taken him out of the community. But what they did is they discovered something quite wonderful. In the beginning of their book, The Jew Within, they set out their discoveries. The single most important finding of our study is decidedly double-edged. That's a good Talmudic phrase, right? On the one hand, right? On the one hand, the American Jews we interviewed overwhelmingly followed a pattern, and they described by a very famous scholar named Bella. The first language is individualism. Their language is universal, liberal, and personalist. Community, though a buzzword or a felt need, is a second language. Community and commitment are redefined by my individual. People will say, what do I get out of the shul? But then he says this, here's the next line. Yet here the postmodern study weighs in. The labor of fashioning a Jewish self remains deeply significant to moderately affiliated American Jews. We can state with confidence that the quest for Jewish meaning is extremely important to our subjects, just as that quest is important to Americans. American Jews seek an abiding significance in their lives that goes beyond the activities of daily life. They readily discuss highly personal searches for transcendent meaning and confessed to a degree which surprised us, that's a confession of a sociologist, to a belief in God. Synagogue becomes important again. Important to a generation that's looking for something. Now that we're completely settled in America, completely comfortable in America, completely secure in America, now we understand that synagogue can give us something that no other form of American life can give us. It can give us a sense of transcendent meaning. And there is a return in some strange way to synagogues, but not the synagogues we grew up in. And so at the very end of my pamphlet here, I give you a couple of statements from some two modern experiments in American synagogues, one called Ikar here in Los Angeles, and one called The Kitchen in San Francisco. And you'll note in these statements how American synagogue life has changed. The Ikar people say in this wonderful moment of our turmoil, we believe religious communities must reemerge with moral courage, spiritual strength. In The Kitchen, they talk about Judaism is about provoking awe and purpose. In some very real way, these new synagogues, these new expressions of synagogue life, and they're all over the country right now. And some of them are independent institutions like The Kitchen and Ikar, and some of them are happening within established synagogues, and some of them are happening as established synagogues melt away and new institutions come to grasp the imagination of American Judaism. A new reemergence of an interest in spirituality, meaning Torah, a remarkable sort of renaissance in the world of spirituality. Once again, the ever-dying people is an ever-renewing people. And all you have to do is look around. So the answer to the question is, will the synagogue survive? Well, the synagogue that I grew up in is not going to survive. The synagogue that I lead is not going to survive. But then again, the synagogue that I lead is no resemblance to the synagogue of my Zayda, who was an ultra-Orthodox rabbi from Eastern Europe. The synagogue of my children and my grandchildren, and in case you were wondering, there she is, the synagogue that this young woman, Chaya Rina, is going to inherit is going to be a synagogue that looks very different than the synagogue of her Zayda or her Saba, but it's going to be a synagogue that in some way embraces and articulates the deepest meanings of Jewish life, but in her idiom and in her way, and in a new poetry, and in a new music, and in a new form. And that I'm very optimistic to see. So please, if you want to know the question, will synagogue survive? Please meet with me again in 300 years. And I promise you, we will all be very impressed with the answer.
Thank you. I'll put you down for the next meeting then. CSP plans way in advance. I mean, we got our Israel trip in 2025, so we can definitely book you. Just keep healthy. So thank you. Please, I've opened the chat. Please chat your questions, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Let's see. Alice asked the question. So let's talk about the post-COVID world. You are a rabbi of a very big synagogue in the Valley. COVID shut you down. You now have a production studio, I think, in your shul, and you're probably trying to manage people now back in the shul, and yet you probably have a very big online community, is my guess, because COVID has enabled people to find shuls now. You probably have people coming into your shul from all around the world, and you're probably getting strange comments or letters. So tell us, what is synagogue life like for you now in this post-COVID world? Because that has created a big challenge.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. And I'm looking at some of the chats. So to all of you, thank you. It's wonderful to see old friends. When COVID first came, we had to shut down. I remember the day, it was a Thursday, and I had to shut down Shabbos and learn how to do a Shabbos over Zoom, which is a new skill for me. You know, I have a degree in rabbinic Judaism, but nowhere in the Talmud was I taught how to use Zoom. And I wanted to know, what would this pandemic do to us? So I looked for parallels, for analogies. Now, the only analogy is the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, but you can't really learn much from that because that was also the end of the First World War. The other analogy that I found was the Great Depression. And I discovered a wonderful scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, Deborah Newman, who wrote a beautiful book on it was actually her doctoral dissertation on the Jews of New York during the Great Depression. And the chapter on synagogue life makes a very interesting observation that the Great Depression really changed synagogue life remarkably. But, she said, it's not that anything new was invented. What happened is with trends and inventions and innovations that were coming slowly, that were latent in the community, were advanced radically during the Great Depression in order to cope with new conditions. She says the Great Depression advanced the development of American Judaism 10 years for every year of the Depression. And I wondered if the same thing happened. March 20th, 2020, we closed down. And the next day, it was March 20th, 2030. That is, this was going to happen anyway. Judaism was eventually going to become celebrated online. We were going to have this kind of connectivity and this kind of capacity, but it would have taken us 10 years to do it. We did it overnight. And then what happened, the next thing, is that as the pandemic began to wane and people were vaccinated, with or without masks, they started coming back. I don't know what's happening in your shul, but in my shul, the most remarkable thing is that people are just so glad to be back. I can't get my Jews to sit down and shut up so I can start a service because they're schmoozing. We started high holiday services a half an hour late because people were just enjoying the schmooze. They hadn't seen each other in 2 years. They hadn't touched each other in 2.5 years. So what we're seeing is a remarkable evidence of this evolution, but the evolution has been accelerated. We will never go back to what it was before. This experience of being online and being able to talk to Jews and to non-Jews all over the world is now our experience. But at the same time, the opposite trend happens as well. We cherish the opportunities to be in person in the same room with a real passion that we never understood before. We always took it for granted that we could be together at a wedding or a bar mitzvah or a funeral. We never take it for granted again. And so there really is a sense of appreciation of the opportunity to be together in the same room.
I'd like to add, since my wife is a official chazan, and the chazan you're going to enjoy this coming Shabbos at CBI, one of the things we learned was that there are people who couldn't go to shul for many years, and now they can go to shul online. So they begged, please do not turn off the live stream.
Yeah.
So now we've opened synagogue life to people who were otherwise shut out. So that's a big change.
And we added the word mute and unmute to the Jewish vocabulary. Yeah.
Right.
Shabbos, Kiddush, Bracha, and unmute.
Many great questions. So I'll choose a few. Talk to us about intermarriage and how that is dramatically changing synagogue life, or should change synagogue life.
Intermarriage, of course, is a door that opens both ways, right? Intermarriage for some people is their exit from Jewish life. But it's amazing that intermarriage for so many others is not an exit to Jewish life. It's an invitation to people who may have not ever had any kind of religious life to come in. I'll just tell you my own personal story. And I don't offer this as representative because I know the demographics and I know it's not representative. However, my wife has a nephew. My wife has a nephew. And my nephew was, he's born Jewish. He had a bar mitzvah in the family backyard, but absolutely no contact with Jewish life, except for what we do. And my mother-in-law happens to put on a nice Seder and a nice Shabbos table. And he married a beautiful Thai woman from a Thai family, immigrant family. And they have a big, beautiful Thai restaurant here in LA. And this girl is such a beautiful girl. And my nephew got a job on the East Coast, and they moved to the East Coast. And I get a call one day or an email one day, Uncle Eddie, the kids want challah. Could you send me the recipe for challah? Because I taught her how to make challah. I said, of course. And she grew up in a restaurant, so she knows how to bake and cook. So I sent her the recipe for challah. 2 weeks later, I get another email. Uncle Eddie, the kids, I thought maybe we should say the prayer on the challah. Can you send me the prayer on the challah? So I sent her the prayer on the challah, motzi. Then she's 2 weeks later, Uncle Eddie, you remember that wine thing we used to do, how you told a prayer over wine before the challah? Can you send me that too? So I send her that too. Then she says, tell me how to tell your nephew how to come home early on Friday night so we can have Shabbos together. And then, of course, she wants to light candles. So Nina and I, my wife and I, packed up a box. We bought her beautiful candlesticks and 100 Shabbos candles and shipped them to my nephew. And then my nephew calls me and says, what the hell did you do to my wife, right? Now I got to be home on Friday night. I got to bless the kids. I got to make kiddush. I got to light candles. I said, yep. And then, of course, the next step was, Uncle Eddie, can you find me a Jewish nursery school in our neighborhood? I want to send the kids to the Jewish nursery school. My niece, my nephew's son, my wife's nephew's son, she's not Jewish. No halacha. There's no halachic definition of Jewish. But she's lighting Shabbos candles. She's baking challah. She's setting a Shabbos table. She wants to learn how to do a Seder. She's making my nephew into a Jew. The community that I am serving and that my younger colleagues will serve is a far more diverse community in every way than the community that I started with 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I became a rabbi. It will be a community of many, many people who come from multiple cultures and backgrounds and races, of course. Many countries speak many languages, but are coming to us because, well, the same reason that my niece wants to learn how to light candles and bake challah, because they perceive a truth at the heart of what we teach and a deep connection with something bigger than themselves, and they cherish it. And that, I think, is quite a wonderful thing. I mean, intermarriage is going to happen. And for some Jews, it's the end. They're going to leave us and their children will never have anything to do with us. But for a small number, and not an insignificant number, it is a door inward to welcome new Jews into our community who bring us spiritual insights and an appreciation for the true essence of our faith, things that most of us who grew up have never seen. How many times have people lit Shabbos candles and never even paid attention? And here's my niece who says to me, it's the most beautiful thing I do all week. I can't wait to gather the children in my arms and light the candles and say the Kiddush, and I gained a new appreciation for Shabbos from my tiny niece.
That's a great story. Herb asked the question. It's not about synagogues specific, but overall, what's going on with the denominations. So we've seen, you gave us the history of what happened to synagogue, but is the history of what happened with the movements and the
That's
suburban
another
growth.
lecture. Invite me back and I'll give you that lecture.
Okay,
But
Herb.
the answer is very simple. The denominations were created in the 1880s, right? First, you have Reform, which begins in Hamburg in 1880 something or other. And then you have Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, which is the response in modern Orthodoxy is created. And conservatism comes in shortly after that. And then they import it all to America. Tell me something. What institution in the world today that you know that you encounter all the time is still the same from 1880? These things have to change because life is changing. Our perceptions of life are changing. So they're going to change. And you want to know something? When they change, it's not going to be so bad, right? If you can change the name of the Washington football team and the Cleveland baseball team, you can figure out what to do with Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox.
I think the question may be also related to synagogue life. I grew up in the modern Orthodox world, and there seems to be some triumphalism, particularly in Orthodoxy, saying we're the only ones growing, we're the only future of Judaism, particularly in like communities like Chabad. And you know,
do you mean to say that Jews get competitive with each other and divisive with each other and triumphalist with you? That Jews aren't nice to each? My God,
it's a
really?
new thing.
That
Yes.
really happens?
I think the numbers are, I think if you look at the numbers, it's really more about birth rates than it is about people choosing.
You hear all this
become
triumphalist stuff, but
Orthodox.
I got to tell you, the secret is, and if there's a couple of my colleagues are on this thing, underneath the surface, we talk to each other. The Chabad rabbi calls me and says, I need help with a family. I call the Chabad rabbi and say, I need help with a family. He calls me and says, I got it. There is a sense of, in many communities, not everywhere, happens to be that I live in Gan Eden here, that there happens to be a sense of solidarity. And at certain points when crises come, we all band together and say we have to protect each other. And that's what I look to. But I think that the denominations in this, look, right now, the label Reform or Conservative doesn't mean even Orthodox, by the way, doesn't mean very much. There are women Orthodox rabbis conducting congregations across this country. You think my Zeta knew anything about that, right? There are Reform congregations that use more Hebrew in their davening than I do. I'm a conservative rabbi. They're conservative rabbi. The denominational labels mean very little now. What you've got to do is go and meet the rabbi and meet the cantor and meet the community and pray with them and see if you get kavanah living there. And that's really what's going to happen. And eventually what the labels refer to are federations of institutions. And we all know that institutions have a way of hanging on long after they're dysfunctional. And that's what's going on right now. So once again, if you can change the name of a baseball team, you can change the orientation and configuration of denominations. What's the next question?
There's a whole argument going on, a Hebrew school versus camp and the future for Jewish kids, but I'll change the subject.
The answer is yes, you need both. The answer is, in order to raise a Jewish child in this culture, you need a constellation of experiences. And that constellation has to include a strong Jewish family. It has to include an institutional component, namely a synagogue and a school where a kid can learn basic Jewish literacy and see adults doing Jewish. It should include a summer camp, which is the most enveloping Jewish experience there is. It should include time in Israel and a visit to Israel, right? It should include a Jewish charity and a way to do social justice in the world under the banner of Jewish prophetic ethics. You need all of that to create Jews, not one or the other or the other or the other, and all of that. And yes, I know it's expensive. Believe me, I know it's expensive. That beautiful kid whose picture I just put in, I just paid her first installment on a nursery school tuition. I did it with a smile on my face, right? But this is what we're doing. You need a constellation of experiences, and that's how we create Jewish kids.
Let's talk about Jewish kids in the shuls, because you talked about the evolution of synagogues, and then we hit this period of time where they filled with synagogues. And my wife wrote a thesis on Cantor Philip Modell and Beth Emet, which was the big synagogue here, and the hundreds and hundreds of kids that were there on Friday night and Saturday. They wouldn't have double bar mitzvahs.
I drove down from Canoga Park because I was a friend with Garrett, his son. And I love Rabbi Tofield, and I know that community well. And at 9 o'clock on summer nights, we left the synagogue after Havdalah, went outside to watch the fireworks over Disneyland. Yes, I know that community well.
So I didn't grow up there, but I got to hear all the stories of the triple bar and bat mitzvahs. But, you know, and I grew up in the Orthodox world. And if I go to shul now down the street at the Orthodox shul on a Saturday morning, it has families and young kids. But if I go to my synagogue on an average Saturday morning, there's about 2 young kids and they're my children. And the next youngest is my wife. So I don't know if your shul is, you know, unusual, but I would say in the non-Orthodox world, there is a challenge in getting kids back to shul. And I was wondering, do you have any creative ideas? I think moving Hebrew school to Saturday morning would be one, but I just wanted to know how to get
synagogue services on a Shabbos morning are not the best environment to engage kids. Maybe synagogue services, look, there are movies that are rated R. We don't let kids into certain movies, and you wouldn't bring a small child into a fine theater to watch Shakespeare, but you might create a different environment. Instead of saying there's something wrong with these kids, why don't they come to shul? Let's think the other way. What can we do in shul that would be appropriate for these kids? We have a thing called Tat Shabbat. Again, when COVID came, we moved it outside. We have a wonderful, I went 250 people, including 250 tiny little people, show up for Tat Shabbat. We don't make any pretensions to turn it into a real service. We have a lot of fun. We have puppets, we do skits, we have music. It's noisy, it's crazy. People who want a real davening don't come anywhere near it. People who want to bring a 5-year-old to shul just love it. Let's think about what environments might be appropriate to small children and create that environment. Build the box around the kid instead of forcing the kid into the box. That's an educational philosophy.
Last question. Oh, so I should remind people. So Rabbi Feinstein is hitting the road tomorrow. It's going to come down the 405, come to Orange County, California. You'll be at CBI Friday night. I believe your topic is the secret of Jewish survival. So now you have to argue about the Jews surviving, not the synagogue surviving. And then on Shabbos morning at 12:45 p.m., the gift of wonder, Heschel's 50th Yortzeit. So we've already met Heschel today. We'll meet him again on Shabbos.
Look, if you haven't guessed by now, I'm on a personal crusade in this last years of my active career to stomp out, or at least to ameliorate, to moderate that pessimistic, cynical, depressive narrative of Jewish disappearance, because it's that narrative is contributing to our Jewish disappearance. And to try to say something about how wonderful what we have is in the life of Torah, in the life of the Jewish people, and let's celebrate what we got. Yes, there's plenty. Look, I know the demographics, folks. Hell, I know them better than you do. I'm a rabbi. I can make you cry in a 5-minute sermon, but it's enough already. Let's talk about the gifts of our Torah, the gifts of our faith, and how we can bring some ruah, some spirit to this thing, and stop beating our chest and talking about what terrible Jews we are. The reason I brought you those sources before is I wanted to show you that in 1872, they had the same problems. And in 1926, they had the same problems, right? And in 1965, they had the same problems. This is not a new story. The story is wrong. The story is the story of the eternal creativity and spiritual resilience of this people. Let's celebrate that, because that we can energize. If you're going to invest in something, invest in that. All right, what's your last question? I'll give you the truth. Go.
We're out of time for the last question. I will say, though, one of the awesome things about you coming to CBI is you're going to be speaking from the Bima and teaching, not just talking about survival, but teaching Torah. So I want to welcome and hope people will join us online or in person. I want to thank people like Dale Schatz, who lead these creative services that get people to come to shul and make people spiritually excited about davening. I want to thank you, Rabbi Feinstein, for this great program, the history of our synagogues in America. Now, I celebrate 100 years in Africa, so I have a different history than you Americans. My family did not live in the Lower East Side. We had other issues and other challenges, but our challenges in America are real, but I agree with you. Let's celebrate. Let's be proud to be Jews. Let's enjoy Judaism. Come to our shul, go to your shul, go to Dale's shul, go to any shul, or pray online, or read a book about Judaism.
Build a
do
shul.
something.
Build a better
new
shul.
Okay, but when you build, I should ask you, last question: formal pews, or should all future synagogues be built with movable chairs?
No chairs at all.
Sitting on the floor, then the kids will be happy too.
Anywhere you are, and online, and anywhere you are,
in your living room,
anywhere you are,
whatever you want to wear. But you'll be on video, so if you're on video, make sure you're
wearing a shirt.
We've read some good stories about what's happened during shul and some people on video, so be careful. Okay, everybody, Shabbat Shalom. Rabbi Feinstein, see you at shul. Take care, everybody. Rabbi Linson, good to see you as well. Take care, everybody. Be safe and be Jewish. Bye-bye.